Hi there, everybody. As you see, my coworker Caleb is here to help us. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about some video tips for the first week video, and also give you kind of the elevator pitch of things we're doing in this class, and give you a way maybe to think about doing your video for the first week video. Okay, so first tip number one, if you have a coworker like this dude here, it's helpful to take something like a dentist stick and give it to him so he stays quiet for a while. Come here. You want this? There you go. Scoop. Yeah. Okay, that's taken care of. Next, you want to think about the background of your screen and everything that comes into frame for the viewer. So I have my amazing penguin weighted blanket. I love it, but it doesn't really help the video to have like this in the corner. So I'm just gonna scoot it over here. It's very heavy. Okay, that's taken care of. So I wanna check and see how things look. I could probably reduce some glare over here with my curtains. So I'm gonna close this one. There we go. Okay, then I'm gonna check myself. Hair's fine. Make sure I'm all symmetrical with clothing and whatnot. And let's pretend that I'm making a video for you now, starting now. Hello. Let me give you the elevator pitch for food literacy in Atlanta, our class. So, what are we gonna do? We're gonna start by looking at some earlier agricultural writing about the purpose of humans and agriculture. Like, what are people meant to do? What are people for in this world? We start with Wendell Berry because he is kind of a cornerstone in this genre of asking questions, and he's not the only one, but he's kind of an easy way in, especially when we're thinking about histories as it relates to the space of Atlanta and the space of the South. We're also going to be learning about rural literacies. So, what is rural literacy? If we don't know yet, we've got some time to figure that out. Things this class is not going to do. This class is not here to try to convince you to be a vegetarian or to change your eating habits in ways that make you feel weird. I'm not here to do that. I'm not here trying to mess with your eating habits because we are dealing with food. I respect everybody's choices. I respect everybody's food culture, and I'm not going to be pushing, do this kind of eating behavior on you. Because what we're doing is we're doing food studies. So we're learning about how to look at cultural objects like food the way that we would a TV show or a book or a play or other cultural objects of expression that humans make. It's not about trying to change how you necessarily interact with food in an eating way, but we do want to get more critical and get more curious about how we think about the choices that we make when it comes to food. So why are we doing this? Well, with this particular book that we're looking at, Vinegar and Char, this is a collection of poetry dealing with the question of what does it mean to be Southern? What does it mean to be in the South? What is Southern food? And this is not the only kind of collection or instance of food and culture out there. watch a TV show, watch a movie, read a book. Is food completely absent? If it's absent, that tells you something. If it's there, that tells you something too. And it's not just dealing with food in a strong and literal way. There's a lot of people and a lot of authors that are working with concepts like this book here, The Mushroom at the End of the World, where food and food as things that are grown, like vegetables, or in this case, mushrooms, these food moments are becoming theoretical opportunities. So if we're going to be using food in a way to kind of help us expand arguments, or to take arguments from what food allows us to understand, we want to make sure that we're engaging with that in a thoughtful way, rather than just, oh, this is kind of like a cool metaphor and let's see what happens if we apply it. Beyond that, the story of always keep a treat because the coworker comes back. The story of civil rights in the South is so deeply connected to the story of food in the South. We can't look at the history of civil rights in the South without talking about food. End of sentence. Period. So there's this fraught relationship that we need to understand if we're attempting to get literacy about how food and culture and history and things that are happening in the world today, how all of those things are connected. And then what we want to do is we want to be able to apply those ideas, how are all these things connected, to contemporary writers that may not necessarily be setting out to have a lesson of, I want to teach you this thing about food, but there's still things that we can understand about poetry, literature, culture, film, media, that we get a different lens into if we're coming at it from the point of view of what is food asking us to look at, rather than what is a different literary theory framework asking us to look at. Now, to be doing this in the space of Atlanta is really important. For quite a while, Atlanta's been referred to as the Black Mecca. That's a term that is both empowering and fraught with some complicated histories about respectability and what it means to be Black in this particular space. So having Atlanta as kind of at least my locus for where I'm situated and the local area for our Georgia Tech campus, we do need to engage the history and the politics of this specific place. That includes paying attention to how areas like the West Side and the Southwest, when you start to move outside the perimeter and outside of Midtown, there's been a lot of urban planning that goes beyond redlining, but like, how is the public transportation set up? How is MARTA set up in such a way that this city, among many others, has contributed to a system of apartheid in the United States? What am I talking about when I talk about apartheid? Apartheid is a term that we get from South Africa, which referred to an institutionalized and legal separation and segregation of races. Didn't end that long ago. It ended in the 90s. I'm not making this up. You can Google it. So there's many areas in the United States that lots of scholars do consider to be apartheid areas. And for me personally, with my research interests, I focus on the distinction between talking about a food desert and talking about food apartheid. That's not a term that I came up with. There's many, many, many scholars that are working with what to call these food spaces that are part of underserved communities, and coincidentally those communities happen to be more Black, Indigenous, people of color, so by POC, that acronym. Those neighborhoods tend to fall into what the USDA calls food deserts, and what I think we need to more accurately call areas of food apartheid. What's the problem with saying a food desert versus food apartheid? Well, that puts us into a rhetorical place of environmental racism. What is environmental racism? Well, it's racism like you would see as economic racism, but having to do with the environment. So when we use metaphors like a food desert, because that is a metaphor. It's not like you go into an area that's a food desert and there's all this sand that's been made out of French fries. That's not a food desert. A food desert is an area with low access and low income populations, so it's hard to get food. Like, you can't get food within 5 miles without having to do horrible Tetris in your mind for using public transportation areas. That's an aspect of environmental racism when we call it a food desert, because we're using a metaphor to reinforce the idea of a desert. A desert is a place that does not have the means necessary for sustaining human life in easy ways that we are used to in the mass market of food in the United States. So what we're doing when we're saying food desert is we invalidate humans who live quite successfully in deserts, and we invalidate humans who are living in these areas that are called food deserts because we're naturalizing it. A desert is a natural biome, and a food desert is not something that humans created naturally. It's the result of urban planning. It's the result of policy choices, right? So we want to be careful using metaphors like food desert, food oasis, and food swamp, right? So moving forward, let's keep these terms in careful tension, because this use of metaphor can really be problematic when we try to do things like communicate needs of communities and work on policy in communities. And when I say these communities, I'm talking about where I myself live. I live in an area that is mapped as a food desert. So it's these communities, it's my community. If you're living on campus, Georgia Tech is considered a food desert in the map. So how do we feel about being in these communities and having that term put on us? It's a thing to think about. Another reason why it matters to keep these things in mind, to stay away from environmental racism, and also the idea of working towards an asset-based rhetoric as opposed to a deficit-based rhetoric, is, like I talked about a little in the first video that you got from me, there's a lot of saviorship or white saviorship that happens in food desert communities, where people come in who don't necessarily understand the needs of the community and say, this is the thing that I think you need, and I'm going to do this, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter because at least I tried. That's coming from a deficit model of thinking about community engagement. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we think about communities based on what communities communicate, right? So we want to serve the actual needs of the community rather than presuming we know what those needs are. And a final thing I'll mention about things we want to keep in play as we are doing this work is there's a lot of brilliant authors that are asking us all to keep in mind that there is a lot of generational trauma when it comes to things like farming and when it comes to things like cooking. What's generational trauma? It's trauma that gets passed on from one generation to another. So, for example, if you come from a family history where your ancestors and the people that came before you worked in kitchens and did so under whether it's racial or class or gendered discrimination, the idea of going and cooking, like bread baking in the pandemic, that might not be a thing that's soothing for a person culturally, because cooking food has been a place of intergenerational stress. Same thing with farming. We are not far out from the sharecropper system. We are not far out from the American history of enslavement. So we want to be mindful that when we're thinking about the problems that we can read, and when we're thinking about the solutions and potential solutions that we can read, it's not just look at the numbers and see where the problem is. It's really getting to know a community and figuring out what those needs are. Because if you're dealing with a complex situation where you've got layers of information that as an outsider you might not have access to, you've got these metaphors that we've gotten from the language of the USDA, like a food desert, overlaid with urban planning that has created apartheid areas and therefore given us these food apartheid areas. Add that in with the collective trauma that we're experiencing now with COVID-19 and high rates of unemployment, high rates of economic changes across the board for so many families. There's just a lot to keep in mind. And is it possible to do all of this at once? Working on it is the answer. It's possible to work on all of it at once. That's the answer I'm comfortable giving. So that's kind of the overview of ideas that are going to be important as we move through the syllabus. As you make your first week video, you do want to script it. So if I can show you my process here, I wrote out a script and then I practiced it for a while and put it on some Post-its with the pile of books that I was going to use kind of as slideshows throughout my talk. So I had them in order here. They're very heavy. And that kind of became my organization for how I was going to get through talking about everything. Because the titles of the books, the orders that I put them, they kind of became like citations in my script. I chose to film here on my fantastic living room couch to give you a break from all of the videos that you'll be seeing in my office. And also I wanted to be able to introduce to you my origami woodpeckers. I made this big garland in celebration for Pride. It's 350 feet of origami rainbow woodpeckers, and they make me happy. So I wanted to share them with you. So yes, good luck with your first week videos as you move into making them over the weekend. Be sure to answer the prompt, so be sure to talk about the challenge. Yes, talk about the challenge. The challenge is important. And that's all. Remember, dog treats keep the dog quiet. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later.